Chicago in the early 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield wearing a suit and a smile. When people picture that era, they usually jump straight to Al Capone, cigar smoke, Tommy guns, and bodies in the street. But here's the twist almost nobody talks about. Before Capone became the face of American crime, another man ruled the headlines in a completely different way. He didn't look like the typical gang boss. He didn't act like one either, at least not in public. He was the kind of guy who tipped his hat to ladies, cracked jokes with reporters, handed cash to the poor, sent flowers to sick families in Irish neighborhoods, and still found time to show up at church like a respectable citizen. Yet behind that friendly grin was a man so feared that rivals learned one simple rule: never mistake his kindness for weakness. His name was Dean O'Banion, a gangster with the charisma of a celebrity and the instincts of a predator. And what made him truly dangerous wasn't just that he could fight, steal, and kill. It was that he could do all of it while staying beloved by the very city he was poisoning. People laughed with him, trusted him, and defended him, while his crew quietly built a violent empire across the North Side. He became famous for generosity, yet he was also linked to brutal hijackings, ruthless betrayals, and a level of street cunning that kept him alive longer than most men in his position. In a world where criminals were supposed to hide in shadows, Dean walked openly in daylight, almost daring the law, and even daring other gang leaders to stop him. But in Chicago, confidence attracts enemies, and the louder your name becomes, the faster someone starts planning your silence. Because while Dean was entertaining the city with jokes and charm, something far more serious was forming on the other side of town. An Italian power network led by men who didn't care about being loved, only feared. And when those worlds finally collided, the result wasn't just another gang rivalry. It was the beginning of a war that would reshape Chicago forever. So today, we're going to trace how a small-town choir boy turned into one of the most fascinating and most deadly figures of the Prohibition era, and how the same personality that made him famous also made him a target. Because Dean O'Banion didn't just live a double life, he mastered it, right up until the moment Chicago decided it had seen enough. Chicago in the early 1900s wasn't just a city, it was a pressure cooker. Money, politics, poverty, religion, and corruption all lived on the same street, often in the same building. And when most people picture that era, they jump straight to one name: Al Capone. But here's the twist. Before Capone became the face of Chicago's underworld, the North Side already had a king. A man who didn't look like the monster in the stories. A man who could smile for the cameras, tip his hat to women, chat politely with reporters, and still send enemies to early graves without losing sleep. His name was Dean O'Banion, and his story is one of the strangest contradictions in American crime history. A gangster who was publicly adored, even while his hands were soaked in the violence that helped turn Chicago into a battlefield. What makes O'Banion so dangerous, so unforgettable, is that he didn't build fear alone. He built love. In neighborhoods where families struggled to eat, he knew exactly how to play the role of a local hero. He helped people quietly, paid for small emergencies, gave money to those who looked forgotten, and showed up in places where most criminals never bothered to be seen. Churches, community events, funeral homes, hospitals. To many locals, he wasn't a villain. He was a colorful, charming, good lad who kept his word until you crossed him. Because behind that friendly face was a man who carried violence like a habit, the same personality that made him laugh loudly and shake hands warmly could flip into something colder, faster, and lethal in a heartbeat. To understand how someone becomes that, we have to rewind far away from the smoky back rooms of Chicago. Long before bootlegging, before machine guns, before headlines, there was a small town boy with a mischievous streak and a church background. Someone who, on paper, should have grown up ordinary. Dean O'Banion was born in rural Illinois in the 1890s, in a tight-knit working family shaped by Irish immigrant roots and Catholic tradition. In small towns like his, reputation mattered, church mattered, and everybody knew everybody. His early years weren't filled with glamour or crime empires. They were filled with basic routines: school, family rules, Sunday services, local gossip, and the kind of childhood pranks that seem harmless, until you realize those same instincts can later evolve into something more dangerous. But then life hit him hard, early. In those days, sickness didn't just frighten families, it erased them. Tuberculosis, especially, didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a slow robbery. Strength first, then comfort, then time, then hope. When his mother fell ill, the household changed completely. The warmth of home turned into worry and absence, hospital visits, distance, whispered conversations, long silences. For a child, that kind of loss doesn't just create sadness, it creates a crack in the world. And when his mother died, that crack became a break. His father, overwhelmed by grief and desperate to escape reminders, made the decision so many families made back then: leave the place where the pain lives. And the destination wasn't just any city, it was Chicago, one of the most fast-growing, crowded, divided, and corrupt places in America. Chicago offered opportunity, yes, but it also offered temptation with open arms. For a boy arriving from quiet streets into a neighborhood where saloons and gambling dens were part of the landscape, the rules changed instantly. The city didn't raise children, it tested them. The North Side, especially the rougher pockets, was a place where toughness was currency, and survival often depended on who you knew, what you could take, and how quickly you could learn the local code. It was crowded with immigrants chasing work, politicians chasing votes, police chasing bribes, and street crews chasing the thrill of easy money. For someone like O'Banion, already bold, restless, and hungry to prove himself, Chicago wasn't a warning. It was an invitation. And here's where the pattern begins. Because the streets don't usually create criminals out of nowhere, they reward certain behaviors: risk-taking, aggression, charm, loyalty to a crew, and a willingness to cross lines. In this new world, O'Banion started finding people who spoke his language, boys who didn't see crime as evil, but as excitement, freedom, and a fast track out of humiliation. He wasn't the biggest, the strongest, or the richest. What he had was something more useful: personality. The kind of personality that draws people close, makes them laugh, makes them trust you, and makes them underestimate you. That is the most dangerous kind of gangster, because by the time you realize what he is, you're already in his grip. In the next part, we'll move deeper into the North Side streets that shaped him, how petty crime turned into organized hustle, how friendships became criminal alliances, and how a young man with church roots and a nice guy reputation started building the foundation for what would become one of Chicago's most feared gangs. By the time Dean O'Banion reached his teenage years, Chicago had already begun teaching him lessons that school never could. Formal education faded into the background as the streets took center stage. The neighborhood he now called home was loud, crowded, and constantly moving, a place where boys learned early that confidence mattered more than permission. O'Banion didn't arrive as an outsider for long. His sharp tongue, easy laugh, and fearless attitude helped him blend in quickly, and it wasn't long before he was spending more time on street corners than in classrooms. For him, the streets offered something school never did: excitement, respect, and the chance to earn money fast, even if that money came with risk. Small-time crime became his first apprenticeship. Pickpocketing drunks, lifting items from shops, and running quick hustles weren't seen as serious offenses in those neighborhoods. They were rites of passage. What set O'Banion apart, even then, was how comfortable he seemed doing it. While others panicked when police appeared, he joked. While others worried about consequences, he treated it like a game. That calmness under pressure earned him respect and, just as importantly, followers. People wanted to work with him because he made danger feel manageable. He didn't bark orders or act superior. He laughed, teased and made crime feel social. His circle tightened around a few key figures, young men who would later become notorious in their own right. These weren't random companions, they were calculated choices. Banion gravitated toward those who balanced him, friends who were quieter, more serious, or more methodical. Together, they formed a unit that combined charm, planning, and muscle. This balance allowed them to move from petty theft into more organized rackets. Soon, they weren't just stealing, they were controlling territory, intimidating rivals, and offering protection to shop owners who understood exactly what refusal would mean. Encounters with the law came early and often, but they failed to slow him down. Short stints in reformatories and jail cells didn't frighten him. If anything, they sharpened his reputation. Arrests became badges of experience rather than warnings. Each time he walked back onto the streets, he returned with more confidence and more connections. Chicago's justice system at the time was overcrowded, inconsistent, and deeply corrupt, and Banion learned quickly how to exploit that reality. He understood that punishment was temporary, but reputation was permanent. One turning point came when he found steady work in saloons, places that were far more than bars. Saloons were information hubs, recruitment centers, and meeting grounds for criminals of every level. Working behind the scenes, Banion absorbed everything. He listened to conversations, watched deals unfold, and studied how older gangsters moved through the world. He learned how money flowed, how loyalty was bought, and how violence was used strategically rather than emotionally. While others saw chaos, he saw structure. Crime, he realized, could be organized like a business. It was also during this period that his public persona began to take shape. Banion understood the value of appearances long before most gangsters did. He dressed sharply, behaved politely in public, and showed unusual patience with reporters and authority figures. At the same time, he carried weapons constantly and never hesitated to use them when challenged. That contrast, smiling one moment, lethal the next, kept rivals off balance. No one knew which version of him they were going to get, and that uncertainty became a weapon in itself. As his confidence grew, so did his ambitions. He no longer wanted to work under others or split profits unfairly. He wanted control. Slowly, deliberately, he began separating from smaller crews and absorbing the best talent into his own circle. Loyalty mattered deeply to him, and betrayal was something he never forgave. Those who crossed him learned quickly that his friendliness had limits, and that once those limits were reached, mercy disappeared. By the late 1910s, Banion was no longer just another street tough. He was a recognized force on Chicago's North Side, feared by rivals and admired by locals who benefited from his generosity. He attended church, donated openly, and helped families in need, reinforcing the image of a man who looked after his people. But beneath that image, the groundwork for something much larger and far more violent was being laid. In the next part, we'll see how Banion transforms from a neighborhood operator into a full-scale power broker, how politics and organized crime begin to overlap, and how the stage is set for the explosive era that Prohibition would soon unleash. By the time the 1910s were drawing to a close, Dean Banion had already crossed an invisible line that separated ordinary criminals from men who mattered. Chicago was changing fast, industry was booming, immigration was reshaping neighborhoods, and politics had become inseparable from street power. Banion understood something crucial that many others didn't yet grasp. Real power didn't come only from violence, it came from influence. Control the streets, yes, but also control the votes, the unions, the saloons, and the people who moved quietly between them all. His reputation as a dependable enforcer began to open doors that brute force never could. Political ward bosses needed men who could intimidate without drawing attention, who could make problems disappear on election day, and who could be trusted to deliver results. Banion fit that role perfectly. He was reliable, fearless, and most importantly, liked. People didn't just fear him, they enjoyed his company. That made him useful in rooms where open threats would have caused trouble. He could smile, joke, and shake hands while quietly ensuring that ballot boxes were filled correctly and opposition voices stayed silent. This period marked O'Banion's transition from street criminal to power broker. He learned how elections were influenced long before votes were counted, how favors were traded behind closed doors, and how protection worked both ways. Politicians shielded gangsters from prosecution, and gangsters guaranteed political stability in return. It was an unspoken agreement, but one that ran deep through Chicago's system. O'Banion didn't just participate in this arrangement, he thrived in it. At the same time, his criminal operations grew more sophisticated. Small robberies gave way to organized theft, warehouse jobs, and protection rackets that generated steady income. He surrounded himself with men who complemented his leadership style: planners, gunmen, drivers, and fixers. Each had a role, and O'Banion made sure they were paid well and protected fiercely. Loyalty wasn't just expected, it was rewarded. That loyalty would later become one of his greatest strengths and eventually one of the reasons his death would ignite chaos. Despite his growing power, O'Banion never abandoned the public image that set him apart. He continued donating to churches, helping struggling families, and showing up at community events. Newspapers loved him because he gave them quotes, jokes, and access. Where other gangsters hid or threatened reporters, O'Banion entertained them. He understood that visibility could be a shield. If people saw him as a local character rather than a monster, it became harder to paint him as a villain, at least publicly. But beneath the charm, the violence was escalating. Truck hijackings became more frequent, and rivals who challenged his authority often disappeared quietly. O'Banion developed a reputation for being unpredictable when crossed. He laughed easily, but when betrayed, he was ruthless. This dual nature, generous one moment, merciless the next, made him difficult to read and even harder to challenge. Competitors didn't know whether they were dealing with a friendly negotiator or a man ready to kill. By the end of the decade, O'Banion had effectively positioned himself at the center of the North Side's criminal ecosystem. He had political protection, loyal soldiers, public goodwill, and growing wealth. What he didn't yet have was the single event that would multiply all of that power overnight. That event arrived in January 1920, when the United States did something unprecedented. It outlawed alcohol. Prohibition wasn't just a law, it was an opportunity unlike anything criminals had ever seen before, and Dean O'Banion was ready. In the next part, we'll see how Prohibition turns O'Banion from a powerful local figure into a millionaire kingpin, how bootlegging reshapes Chicago's underworld, and how his success begins to draw the attention of far more dangerous enemies. When Prohibition officially took effect in January 1920, it didn't dry up Chicago, it flooded it. Overnight, alcohol became illegal, but demand exploded. Saloons didn't close, they went underground. Ordinary citizens who had never broken the law suddenly became customers in an illegal marketplace. And for men like Dean O'Banion, Prohibition wasn't a moral issue or a political debate. It was the greatest business opportunity of a lifetime. O'Banion moved faster than most. He had already spent years building connections with saloon owners, politicians, and distributors. Now he redirected those relationships into a single mission: total control of the North Side's alcohol supply. He focused first on beer, knowing it was cheaper, easier to move, and consumed in massive quantities. Quality mattered to him. He refused to sell low-grade alcohol that could make customers sick, understanding that loyalty was built through reliability. People trusted O'Banion's product, and that trust became currency. His distribution network expanded rapidly. Trucks, wagons, and hidden storage locations moved alcohol through the city day and night. Informants were paid well, police were bribed regularly, and rival operators were either absorbed or eliminated. O'Banion wasn't interested in sharing territory. If someone interfered with his routes or hijacked one of his shipments, the response was swift and brutal. This era saw his reputation for violence truly solidify. Smiling or not, everyone understood one thing clearly: his business was untouchable. At the same time, O'Banion perfected the balance between visibility and protection. He openly mocked Prohibition laws, joking with reporters while carrying multiple firearms under custom-made suits. He never drank alcohol himself, an irony that fascinated the public and reinforced his image as disciplined and controlled. He sold the best liquor in the city, yet remained sober, alert, and constantly calculating. That clarity gave him an edge over rivals who drank their own profits away. Money poured in at an astonishing rate. What had once been a street operation became an empire. Profits from beer and whiskey funded safer vehicles, better weapons, stronger political ties, and deeper influence in city affairs. Judges looked the other way. Police warnings arrived in advance. When arrests did happen, charges quietly disappeared. O'Banion had become part of the system that Prohibition claimed it was trying to stop, but success always attracts attention. While O'Banion was consolidating power on the north side, a different kind of operation was rising in the south. There, Italian gang leaders were organizing crime with military precision, treating bootlegging not as chaos but as corporate expansion. Men like Johnny Torrio and his ambitious lieutenant, Al Capone, were building something larger than any single neighborhood. They watched O'Banion closely, and they didn't like what they saw. The tension between the north side and south side wasn't just about territory. It was cultural, personal, and deeply hostile. O'Banion's open mockery, his refusal to show deference, and his habit of hijacking rival shipments turned irritation into resentment. Deals were made, truces were discussed, but trust was thin and temporary. Beneath polite meetings and shared profits, both sides were preparing for conflict. By the early 1920s, Chicago had become a powder keg. O'Banion stood at the top of the north side, rich, famous, and fearless. But his greatest strength, his boldness, was also becoming his greatest weakness. Because, while he laughed, joked, and taunted his rivals, the south side was learning, adapting, and waiting for the right moment to strike. In the next part, we'll dive into the uneasy alliances, betrayals, and personal insults that turn rivalry into open war, and how O'Banion's own actions begin pushing him toward a deadly edge he may not be able to step back from. As the bootlegging business exploded, Chicago's underworld reached a fragile understanding. Violence was bad for profits. Meetings were held, compromises suggested, and territories loosely divided. On paper, it looked like peace. In reality, it was a truce built on ego, mistrust, and greed. Dean O'Banion agreed to cooperate just enough to keep business flowing, but he never truly believed in playing nice. To him, agreements were temporary tools, not binding rules, and that mindset slowly turned allies into enemies. O'Banion's dealings with the South Side were tense from the start. Johnny Torrio approached crime like a corporation, preferring negotiation over chaos, numbers over noise. O'Banion was the opposite, instinctive, theatrical, and openly contemptuous of men he didn't respect. He mocked rivals in public, hijacked shipments even during supposed truces, and hid behind charm when confronted. When accused, he smiled, denied everything, and dared anyone to prove otherwise. That attitude infuriated men who valued hierarchy and discipline. The insults weren't always subtle. O'Banion openly ridiculed Italian gangs, dismissed their traditions, and made it clear he had no intention of being subordinate to anyone. While Torrio tried to maintain balance, his lieutenant Al Capone took these slights personally. Capone saw O'Banion not just as competition, but as a threat, one who humiliated rivals while weakening the system Torrio was trying to build. The hatred between them wasn't business only. It was emotional, and emotions make wars inevitable. Despite this, money kept everyone restrained for a while. Profits were shared, territories overlapped, trucks were sometimes returned instead of stolen. But O'Banion couldn't resist pushing boundaries. He hijacked shipments simply to prove he could. He laughed about it afterward, turning serious confrontations into jokes. To him, intimidation was part of the performance. To his rivals, it was a declaration of disrespect. At the same time, O'Banion's personal life added another layer to his public image. He married, settled into a comfortable home, and invested in legitimate businesses, including a flower shop that doubled as a front for operations. The irony was striking. A man responsible for death and violence spending his mornings arranging bouquets. Customers loved him. Employees respected him. Even some rivals admired the audacity. But behind that calm routine, danger was tightening around him. What O'Banion underestimated was how patience works differently across cultures and power structures. While he treated conflict like a game of nerves, the South Side treated it like a ledger, every insult noted, every loss recorded, every betrayal remembered. Torrio still hoped to avoid bloodshed, but the men around him were losing patience. To them, O'Banion wasn't just disruptive, he was bad for business and worse for authority. The final cracks began to show when O'Banion crossed lines that couldn't be smoothed over with jokes. He interfered in territories he had promised to avoid. He embarrassed powerful figures in front of their own men. And worst of all, he began testing how far political protection could really stretch. Each move made him richer and more famous, but also more isolated. By now, O'Banion was no longer just a rival. He was a problem that needed a solution. And in Chicago's underworld, problems weren't argued away forever. They were eliminated. In the next part, we'll see how a series of calculated betrayals and one devastating setup bring O'Banion closer to his enemies than he realizes, and how the smile that once protected him begins to fail. By 1924, the balance that had kept Chicago's underworld from collapsing into full-scale war was wearing dangerously thin. Dean O'Banion sensed it, but he misread it. Where others saw warning signs, he saw leverage. He believed his charm, political connections, and reputation made him untouchable. That belief would prove fatal. Because while O'Banion continued treating conflict like a contest of nerve, his enemies had quietly shifted strategies. They were no longer reacting to him, they were planning around him. The first sign that the rules had changed came when O'Banion attempted something far bolder than a hijacking or an insult. He tried to outmaneuver the South Side, not with gunfire, but with law enforcement. Using advanced knowledge of police raids, he set up a situation that led to Johnny Torrio's arrest during a brewery operation. On the surface, it looked like bad luck. Behind the scenes, it was a calculated move. O'Banion knew that a second Prohibition offense could send Torrio to prison, and removing him from the streets would leave a power vacuum. In O'Banion's mind, that vacuum would belong to him. The plan worked, partially. Torrio was arrested, and the South Side took a financial hit. But instead of collapsing, they adapted. Al Capone stepped further into leadership, hardening the organization and sharpening its resolve. What O'Banion intended as a strategic checkmate became something far worse, proof that he was willing to weaponize the law itself. That crossed an unspoken line. Crime was one thing. Turning the authorities into tools against rivals was another. From that moment on, O'Banion wasn't just disrespectful, he was dangerous to the entire system. Despite the growing hostility, O'Banion behaved as though nothing had changed. He bragged openly about outsmarting Torrio. He mocked his rivals in front of reporters and associates. He continued hijacking shipments and expanding operations as if retaliation were impossible. Even close allies warned him to slow down, to show restraint, to let tensions cool. O'Banion laughed it off. He had escaped trouble too many times to believe this would be different. At the same time, his enemies were doing something O'Banion rarely did. They were waiting. They understood that killing a man like O'Banion required timing, permission, and the right symbolism. His death couldn't look chaotic. It had to look inevitable. Approval had to come from higher authorities within organized crime, men who valued stability over personal vendettas. For a long time, that approval had been blocked by political and financial considerations, but as O'Banion continued pushing, those protections began to disappear. Then fate removed the final obstacle. A powerful mediator who had kept the peace, someone whose influence had shielded O'Banion from assassination, fell gravely ill. Everyone knew what that meant. Once that influence was gone, old restraints would vanish with it. O'Banion knew this too, yet instead of retreating, he doubled down. He insulted rivals more openly, refused to compromise, and made it clear that he had no intention of changing course. Ironically, the place where O'Banion felt safest was the one that would seal his fate. His flower shop, quiet, respectable, and located across from a cathedral, had become both a business and a headquarters. It symbolized everything he believed protected him: legitimacy, routine, and public visibility. He spent hours there, arranging flowers, greeting customers, and conducting business in plain sight. To him, it was proof that he could exist openly in a world built on secrecy. To his enemies, it was the perfect location. In the next part, we'll walk through the final days leading up to O'Banion's assassination, how decisions made in confidence, habit, and arrogance place him exactly where his enemies want him, and why, when the moment comes, there will be no escape. In the days leading up to Dean O'Banion's death, there was a strange calm around him, not the calm of safety, but the calm of routine, of a man who had survived danger so many times that it no longer felt urgent. Chicago was buzzing with rumors, alliances were shifting quietly, and powerful men were making decisions that would soon spill blood. Yet O'Banion continued moving through the city as if nothing had changed. He attended meetings, joked with reporters, and spent long hours at his flower shop, convinced that familiarity was protection. The death of a key power broker removed the last real barrier standing between O'Banion and his enemies. With that influence gone, permission was finally granted, unspoken but understood. The decision wasn't framed as revenge, it was framed as necessity. O'Banion had become unpredictable, disruptive, and openly defiant. In a system that relied on balance, he was a destabilizing force. From the perspective of his rivals, eliminating him wasn't personal, it was corrective. What makes this period especially haunting is how little O'Banion changed his behavior. Friends warned him, loyal associates urged caution. He ignored them all. His confidence had hardened into arrogance, and arrogance into blindness. He still believed that public spaces were safe, that enemies wouldn't dare act so openly. After all, he was known, recognized, and watched. Surely no one would risk the fallout of killing him in broad daylight. The flower shop remained his favorite refuge. It was clean, quiet, and filled with the scent of fresh arrangements, a sharp contrast to the violence he commanded elsewhere. On the morning of his final day, O'Banion was doing exactly what he often did, preparing floral wreaths for funerals, including one for a powerful figure whose death had reshaped the balance of power in the city. There was a bitter irony in that task, though O'Banion didn't seem to notice it. Visitors came and went. Some were customers, others were familiar faces from the criminal world, paying respects or placing orders. Nothing felt out of place. That normality was the trap. O'Banion's enemies knew his habits well. They knew where he stood, how he greeted people, and how much he relied on courtesy and routine. The plan didn't require chaos, just precision. When the men finally entered the shop, there was no dramatic warning, no shouting, no hesitation. O'Banion greeted them the way he greeted everyone else, politely, confidently, extending his hand. In that brief moment, his instincts finally caught up with reality. He sensed something was wrong, but it was too late to act. The setting he believed protected him now worked against him. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and no time to reach for the weapons he always carried. The gunfire was sudden and brutal. Shots tore through the calm of the shop, shattering glass and silence alike. O'Banion fell almost instantly, struck multiple times before he could even react. The man who had survived years of violence, betrayals, and close calls was gone in seconds. Killed not in an alley or a street war, but in the most respectable place he owned. The assassins fled quickly, disappearing into the city before police could respond. By the time authorities arrived, the damage was done. Dean O'Banion was dead at 32 years old. The North Side had lost its leader, Chicago had lost one of its most notorious personalities, and the fragile peace holding the city together was about to collapse. In the next part, we'll explore the immediate aftermath of O'Banion's murder, how Chicago reacted, how his enemies miscalculated the consequences, and why his death didn't end violence. It unleashed it. The news of Dean O'Banion's death spread through Chicago with astonishing speed. Within hours, the story dominated conversations in saloons, union halls, police stations, and newsrooms. Some people reacted with disbelief, others with quiet satisfaction, but many felt genuine shock. O'Banion wasn't just another gangster who had been eliminated. He was a public figure, a familiar face, someone people felt they knew. His murder didn't feel distant or abstract. It felt personal, and that made it dangerous. On the North Side, grief turned quickly into rage. O'Banion's crew didn't just lose a boss, they lost a symbol. He had been their shield, their strategist, and their voice. Without him, there was no question of retreat or compromise. The men closest to him didn't ask who was responsible. They already knew. And more importantly, they didn't ask permission before planning their response. The rules that had restrained them while O'Banion was alive no longer applied. Chicago authorities, meanwhile, found themselves in a familiar position, overwhelmed and reactive. The killing had been clean, fast, and professionally executed. Witnesses were vague or suddenly forgetful. Evidence was thin. No arrests followed. Publicly, officials condemned the violence. Privately, many understood exactly why it had happened. O'Banion's death was the result of years of provocation, arrogance, and unresolved conflict. But understanding didn't make controlling what came next any easier. The funeral itself became a spectacle, one that revealed just how deeply O'Banion's influence had reached. Thousands lined the streets. Floral arrangements filled entire buildings. The scale of the display sent a clear message. This wasn't the end of the North Side, it was a declaration. His associates made sure everyone saw it. The city watched as wealth, loyalty, and power were put on public display, daring anyone to think the organization had weakened. Behind the scenes, leadership shifted quickly. O'Banion's closest lieutenants stepped forward, each driven by a mix of loyalty, grief, and ambition. They understood that hesitation would be interpreted as weakness. Plans were drawn, alliances tested, and targets selected. The South Side may have believed they had solved a problem, but they had misjudged one crucial thing. O'Banion had held his crew together. His death didn't dissolve them. It unified them. Violence escalated almost immediately. Retaliatory attacks followed, each more aggressive than the last. What had once been controlled competition exploded into open warfare. Streets that had been tense became deadly. Businesses closed early. Ordinary citizens felt the impact as gunfire echoed through neighborhoods that had grown used to criminal influence but not outright war. The balance that leaders had tried to maintain for years was gone. Ironically, the very outcome O'Banion's enemies had hoped to avoid, chaos, had arrived because of his death. Instead of stabilizing Chicago's underworld, the assassination destabilized it completely. Every faction prepared for the worst. Trust evaporated, meetings were cancelled or heavily guarded. Men who once moved openly now traveled in convoys, armed and alert. Dino Banion was gone, but his presence lingered everywhere. His style, his defiance, and his refusal to submit had set events in motion that could no longer be controlled. Chicago was entering one of its bloodiest periods yet, and the war that followed would make his life seem almost restrained by comparison. In the next part, we'll examine how this violence reshaped Chicago's criminal landscape, how new leaders emerged from the chaos, and why O'Banion's death marked not an ending but a turning point that defined an era. In the months following Dino Banion's assassination, Chicago became a city at war with itself. What had once been a carefully managed criminal ecosystem fractured into open hostility. Gunmen stalked streets in broad daylight, ambushes became routine, and fear settled into neighborhoods that had previously coexisted with organized crime. O'Banion's death didn't remove a problem, it removed the last restraint holding back a flood of violence. The North Side Gang, now driven by vengeance rather than strategy, launched a relentless campaign against the South Side. Retaliatory killings followed one after another, each attack escalating the conflict. Men who had once been cautious now acted impulsively, determined to prove that O'Banion's murder would not go unanswered. Chicago newspapers filled their front pages with headlines of shootings, bombings, and public executions, turning gang warfare into daily entertainment for a stunned public. On the South Side, leadership hardened. Al Capone, no longer overshadowed by more diplomatic figures, embraced power with brutal efficiency. Where O'Banion had relied on personality and audacity, Capone relied on structure, fear, and overwhelming force. He expanded operations, tightened discipline, and ensured loyalty through both rewards and terror. The conflict with the North Side became a proving ground, one that would eventually cement Capone's dominance over the city. Yet even as Capone rose, the shadow of O'Banion remained. Many of the tactics used by both sides during the war were shaped by the example O'Banion had set. Bold public gestures, psychological intimidation, and the blending of crime with public spectacle. His defiance had rewritten the rules, and now everyone was playing by them, whether they wanted to or not. For ordinary Chicagoans, the cost was immense. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. Businesses were extorted or destroyed. Trust in law enforcement eroded further, as corruption and incompetence became impossible to ignore. Prohibition, intended to restore moral order, had instead turned the city into a battlefield, and at the center of that transformation stood the legacy of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone. Historians would later debate whether O'Banion was reckless or visionary, foolish or fearless. Some saw him as a tragic figure, a product of his environment who never learned when to stop. Others viewed him as a calculating manipulator whose charm masked ruthless ambition. The truth lies somewhere in between. He was both generous and violent, disciplined and impulsive, loved and feared. Those contradictions made him unforgettable. What cannot be debated is this: O'Banion changed Chicago. He accelerated the rise of organized crime, forced rivals to modernize, and demonstrated how image could be as powerful as violence. His death didn't erase him, it amplified him. The war that followed became part of his story, ensuring his name would be remembered long after the gunshots faded. In the final part, we'll step back and reflect on what Dino Banion truly represents, why his story still matters, what it tells us about power and ego, and how one man's choices reshaped an entire era of American crime. Dean O'Banion's story is more than a tale of gang wars, bootlegging, and bullets. It is a lesson in how power, when mixed with ego, eventually turns inward. He wasn't the most brutal gangster Chicago ever produced, nor was he the most organized. What made him dangerous was his belief that personality could outrun consequences. For years it worked. His charm disarmed enemies, his generosity won public affection, and his boldness kept rivals guessing. But in the end, the same traits that elevated him also exposed him. Banion proved that crime in Prohibition-era America was no longer confined to dark alleys and hidden rooms. It was public, theatrical, and deeply entangled with politics, business, and media. He understood image before most criminals did. He knew that being loved could be just as powerful as being feared. And for a time, he mastered both. Yet history shows us that systems built on disrespect and constant provocation eventually correct themselves, often violently. His assassination did not end the North Side Gang. It did not bring peace to Chicago. Instead, it ignited one of the bloodiest periods the city had ever seen and accelerated the rise of figures who would become even more ruthless and organized. In that sense, Banion didn't just participate in history, he shaped it. His death marked the moment when Chicago's underworld shifted from personality-driven chaos to corporate-style criminal empires. Today, nearly a century later, his story still resonates because it feels familiar. Ambition without restraint, success without humility, the belief that rules apply to everyone else. Banion's life reminds us that power gained quickly can disappear just as fast, and that no amount of charm can protect someone forever in a world ruled by violence and memory. If you've watched this far, drop a comment and let us know what you think. Was Dean Banion a reckless showman who sealed his own fate, or a brilliant strategist taken out by men who couldn't control him? Your perspective matters, and we read every comment. If you found this story gripping, like the video, it really helps the channel reach more history lovers. And if you want more deep cinematic breakdowns of real crime, power, and forgotten history, subscribe to the Epoch Lens channel. This is exactly the kind of story we tell here, carefully researched, long form, and made for viewers who want more than surface-level history. Thanks for spending this time with Epoch Lens. We'll see you in the next story.